Since Roe versus Wade was decided in 1973, these are absolutely the most extreme laws that have been passed. And given the composition of the Supreme Court, I think it's fair to say the right to abortion is more vulnerable right now than any time since 1973. 2020 literally could not be more important. This is a hugely important election for the courts and for the future of Roe. My name is Kate Shaw. I'm a Supreme Court contributor with ABC and a law professor. I write, among other things, about abortion, reproductive rights, and justice. And here's everything you need to know about the new wave of abortion laws. So Roe versus Wade involved a state ban on abortion with criminal penalties, and a woman who wished to obtain an abortion challenged that law and won in the Supreme Court. So since Roe versus Wade, the Supreme Court has held the Constitution protects the right to terminate a pregnancy.
The Supreme Court today ruled that abortion is completely a private matter to be decided by mother and doctor in the first 3 months of pregnancy.
I think that we see a real shift starting in 2019. These laws represent direct frontal attacks on Roe versus Wade. Alabama, I think, is absolutely the most extreme of the states in this category. So Alabama has essentially a total ban on abortion. Alabama's law also imposes very heavy criminal penalties on any doctor who performs an abortion. Then there are laws like Georgia's, Ohio's, Kentucky's that would prohibit all abortions after 6 weeks of pregnancy.
Missouri is now the 5th state this year to pass a heartbeat bill, which means a state will not perform the procedure if a heartbeat is detected. But neither the Alabama law nor the proposed Missouri bill have exemptions for cases of rape or incest. Abortions would only be allowed if there's a serious health risk to the mother.
Even in states where these laws have been passed, they are not in effect. So all of these laws are being challenged immediately upon passage, and all of them either have been or will be blocked by federal courts. So what these laws represent is a desire to get the Supreme Court to revisit Roe versus Wade.
And I think all of our goal is to have Roe versus Wade turned over.
For the last couple of decades, I would say, the strategy has primarily been to restrict access to abortion, but not to attempt to prohibit abortion outright. So in particular, low-income women and low-income women of color have, in many states, found it almost impossible for quite some time to access abortion. The law, as it currently stands, is pretty clear that states cannot prohibit abortion outright. They can do a lot of things to regulate abortion, including things that might make it more difficult to access abortion, but they can't prohibit abortion outright, and that is what is so new about this wave of laws we've seen just in the last couple of months. But none of these laws is in effect, and none can go into effect unless and until the Supreme Court revisits Roe versus Wade. I think the change that we've seen starting in 2019 has everything to do with Brett Kavanaugh. So the Supreme Court's composition changed in a hugely significant way last fall when Justice Brett Kavanaugh was confirmed to replace Justice Anthony Kennedy.
Monumental moment for the Supreme Court. Today we learned Justice Anthony Kennedy is retiring from the court. He hand-delivered his letter to President Trump.
Now, Justice Kennedy was a Republican appointee and conservative in many respects, but he had voted in a number of key cases to reaffirm the core holding of Roe versus Wade. Now, Justice Kavanaugh hasn't had a chance to vote on the merits on an abortion case since being confirmed at the Supreme Court, but I think that these state legislatures have looked at Justice Kavanaugh's record in the D.C. Circuit and his general philosophy of constitutional interpretation, and they think there's a very strong chance that if he had a case before him that allowed him to reconsider Roe versus Wade, that he would vote to overturn it. And I think they're right to make that assumption. In theory, sometime in late 2019 or early 2020, the court could at least have before it the possibility of taking one of these cases. So if the Supreme Court does take one of these cases that requires it to tackle head-on the question of the future of Roe versus Wade, I think there are pretty clearly 4 votes on the Supreme Court to overturn Roe. I think that Justice Thomas, Justice Alito, Justice Gorsuch, and most likely Justice Kavanaugh would join an opinion overturning Roe. So the big question is the Chief Justice, John Roberts. He might worry that the message it would send for the 5 Republican appointees on the court to join an opinion overturning this nearly 50-year-old precedent, Roe versus Wade, would send a message to the public that the court is just another political body. The last time the Supreme Court walked very close to the edge of overturning Roe versus Wade in 1992, a little bit like now, many people thought that Roe was sort of on the chopping block. There were a couple of new Republican appointees on the Supreme Court, and many people thought Roe was very vulnerable. And the Supreme Court walked up to the edge of overturning Roe, and then pulled back and actually reaffirmed the core holding of Roe versus Wade. And it surprised many, many people when it did that.
We interrupt because the Supreme Court has made another important decision on the question of abortion.
Roe versus Wade has not been overruled. The practical effect of this ruling would be to continue the erosion of Roe versus Wade, allowing states ever more authority to regulate abortion, but not to prohibit abortion.
This was an issue that was so socially divisive that for the Supreme Court to step in and overturn this important precedent would essentially demonstrate to the public that the court was responding to political pressure, that the court was a political institution. And that was a significant reason that the court gave for pulling back from the edge. If Roe versus Wade were overturned, the question of abortion regulation would go to the states. So states could continue to protect abortion access, and blue states almost certainly would, but states would have no constitutional restrictions on how they could regulate and even prohibit abortion. So in addition to the states that have recently moved to restrict or ban abortion, you have other states that have laws on the books, very old laws, many of them, that would essentially become enforceable. So you would have a number of states in which abortion would be immediately illegal if Roe were overturned. On both sides, this will be a very significant election year issue. So you have an aging Supreme Court, in particular some of the more liberal justices. It is very likely that whoever is elected president in 2020 will be able to make 1 or 2 or 3 additional appointments to the Supreme Court. And that could affect the future of Roe versus Wade and the law in a range of areas for a generation or more. So this is a hugely important election for the courts and for the future of Roe. Whatever happens in these states and whatever happens in the Supreme Court, the issue of abortion isn't going away anytime soon.